Emma, where are you right now? Why aren't you picking up the phone?
As soon as I answered the phone, my mother started yelling at me.
I'm at home right now.
Without getting flustered by my mother's anger, I calmly replied,
Why did you leave me behind? Aren't you worried about your mother?
She was clearly in an agitated state. I sighed softly before expressing my feelings.
I can't continue living with you anymore. That's why I decided to leave this house.
She seemed quite surprised.
Why are you suddenly saying this? You don't love me anymore? I cannot live without you. What am I supposed to do when I leave the hospital? I need care, you know.
At this moment, I already knew the truth about my mother. I'm Emma, 36 years old. I work for a major company in the city. I started working mostly from home a few years ago for a reason. My parents divorced when I was young, and my mother raised me on her own. I don't remember what my father looked like. I only know that his name is Johann, and he is the same age as my mother. According to my mother, my father was quite a playboy. He treated my mother like a housemaid and constantly complained. He started spending more time with his affair partner, and eventually he left the house. What a terrible man. Currently, there's no way to contact him at all. My mother supposedly discarded all the photos of him a long time ago. After divorcing my father, my mother gained custody. She said that she didn't even have to fight for it. My mother took me in and raised me with great care. I'm filled with gratitude towards her. Thanks to her, I graduated from college and got a job at a major company. I received a lot of love from my mother growing up, so I didn't feel lonely. Besides, I don't feel the need to see my father now. My mother always spoke of my father in this manner.
That man wasn't any good. So, just think that you never had a father from the beginning. You're my precious daughter, of whom I'm so proud.
When I heard about the way my father treated my mother and his relationships with other women, I felt sorry for my mother and was filled with anger towards my father. During school events like open classes and sports days, I hardly ever felt envious. Even when I saw that my friends' parents both came. I was living, thinking that I don't have a father, just as my mother had said. When I started working, I began living alone as well, and I was spending busy, but fulfilling and rewarding days. When I turned 26, something happened. My mother got injured and was forced to live in a wheelchair. It was due to an unfortunate accident. She had a severe blow to her legs and her hip, making her unable to walk. Consequently, she had to quit her job, and my mother was visibly frustrated. My mother, who has always been cheerful, became gloomy after the accident. That accident not only took away my mother's freedom, but also her smile. She couldn't move her body as she wanted, and gradually, she became depressed. She ended up going to the hospital more often, and her weight decreased significantly. Then, my mother contacted me, asking me to come back home, so I went to visit my family home to take care of her. My mother was probably lonely. I took a week of paid leave from work to focus on caregiving. Initially, I was going to go back to work once my mother recovered. She started smiling more as I came back to our family home. I felt relieved, thinking I could go back to work soon. But when I mentioned it, my mother didn't allow me to return to work. Emma, are you going back to work? Don't leave. Are you going to leave me alone? What a terrible daughter. While saying this, she clung on to me.
Mom, if that's the case, I'll talk to the company and see, so please give me some time.
I was perplexed by my mother's words. I wasn't going to just abandon my mother, who had raised me alone. Moreover, I could see that her mental state was weakening. as her legs weren't functioning properly. I consulted with the company and decided to switch to remote work and work shorter hours until my mother's legs recovered. However, since then, my mother disliked me being alone, and she was always right by my side even when I worked in my room. When I had a Zoom meeting, it wasn't ideal for others to be seen on the computer screen apart from me. So I asked her to leave the room, but she always stayed where she could see me. It felt like I was being watched by my mother, which wasn't a good feeling, but I had no choice. Though my mother continued rehabilitation, there was no improvement in her legs. Therefore, I had no prospect of returning to the main office, and I was troubled. Prioritizing my mother's care, I didn't date anyone. I was living such a life, and 10 years have passed. Currently, my mother is 65, and her dependence on me has worsened compared to before. Whenever I briefly leave home for errands, my mother would panic. It takes time to calm her down each time, so I wasn't in a situation where I could live by myself again. One day, I went to the hospital with her for her regular checkup as usual. The doctor who usually sees her is a male physician in his 40s named Cannon. He's been her doctor for 10 years. As soon as my mother went into the examination room for tests, my colleague called me, so I went outside the hospital to take the call. After finishing the call, I went back inside the hospital and was walking back to the examination room. Then a female doctor talked to me.
Excuse me, you're Catherine's family, right?
Yes, Catherine is my mother. Is something wrong with her? I was bewildered as I was suddenly approached by an unfamiliar doctor.
Please let me introduce myself. My name is Fisher. I'm a junior of Dr. Cannon, who is your mother's attending physician. I would like to talk to you about your mother. If you have time, can I talk to you?
I became anxious about what it could be, and quickly agreed. Then, she guided me to another room with a serious face. It seemed to be a small meeting room, used as a consultation room.
Please, take a seat,
she said, so I sat on the chair. She started talking to me, still with the serious face.
We heard that you've been staying at your family home to take care of your mother. Yes, that's correct. For about 10 years, I've been caring for my mother while working remotely.
Then Dr. Fisher looked down and muttered softly.
It's difficult to say, but...
What she told me next was something shocking. I couldn't believe my ears, but she led me to another room. What I saw there was a shocking scene. We returned to the original room and sat back down. There, Dr. Fisher, with a heavy expression, began speaking to me.
You should distance yourself from your mother right away.
Upon hearing her words, anger towards my mother surged within me. I thanked her and left the hospital after that. Of course, I went straight home without seeing my mother. As soon as I arrived home, I prepared to leave. Even then, the image of my mother I saw at the hospital repeatedly crossed my mind. About 3 hours had passed, and I was about to finish packing. While I was packing, I had received numerous calls from my mother. She probably finished her checkup and rehab, and she was anxious because I wasn't at the hospital. But I continued to ignore her calls. When I finished packing, I finally answered my mother's call.
Emma, where are you now? Why aren't you answering the phone?
As soon as I answered the phone, my mother started shouting.
I'm at home right now.
I replied calmly, without being rattled by my mother's anger.
Why did you leave me behind? Aren't you worried about your mother?
She was clearly agitated. After a small sigh, I expressed my feelings.
I can't live with you anymore. That's why I've decided to leave this house.
She seemed quite surprised.
Why are you suddenly saying this? You don't love me anymore? If you leave me, I won't be able to live. What am I supposed to do when I leave the hospital? I need caregiving.
I confidently told my mother.
Mom,
Your legs had healed a long time ago and you can actually walk without problem, right? You don't need a wheelchair or caregiving at all. I know everything. My words made my mother raise her voice.
how do you know that? Who told you?
I explained to my mother what Dr. Fisher had told me and what I had witnessed at the hospital. According to Dr. Fisher, in recent tests, they found no abnormalities with my mother's body and wondered why she couldn't walk. Dr. Fisher thought about it for a while and concluded that it might be due to my mother's own belief. She told me that believing I can't walk sometimes actually cause the inability to walk. In such cases, psychological care is needed, and they needed my help. Right after that, Dr. Fisher said,
Come with me.
and led me to the door of the examination room, where my mother was. Dr. Fisher slightly opened the door.
Please take a look at this.
My mother was sitting normally on the chair in the examination room. The wheelchair was placed to the side, and there were crutches on the floor. Immediately after that,
Dr. Cannon, thank you always.
my mother said, and stood up from the chair unassisted. She rose from the chair without using a cane, and prepared to leave, putting on her coat. She always gets a patch at the hospital, and after she replaced the patches, she was walking towards the garbage bin to throw away the old patch without assistant. Seeing my mother walking with light steps, I couldn't find any words to say. My mother didn't know that I was watching. Afterwards, Dr. Fisher and I moved a little farther away so my mother wouldn't notice. My mother came out of the room sitting in the wheelchair with a nonchalant expression on her face. She headed towards the adjacent rehabilitation facility. Dr. Fisher said to me,
Emma, are you okay?
after I stood there dumbfounded for a while, I came to my senses. My mother wasn't incapable of walking, nor did she believe she couldn't walk. She pretended to be unable to walk, demanding caregiving from me. As I was feeling mixed emotions of anger and regret, Dr. Fisher put her hand on my shoulder and whispered to me, "You can do it." I quickly packed to move away from home, as Dr. Fisher advised. As I told her what I saw at the hospital, my mother listened in silence. But after a few minutes, she started telling the truth.
It is true that I was in a traffic accident. It wasn't a lie. Also, I had severe injuries, and I needed a caregiver. With diligent rehab, I was able to walk again with a cane about a year and a half after the accident. I'm sorry for keeping silent. Listening to my mother's words, anger surged from the depths of my heart. I spent 10 years taking care of you. I did that for nothing? You were able to walk with a cane a year and a half after the accident? You've got to be kidding me.
Then, over the phone, my mother replied,
Emma, you would have left me if you knew that, wouldn't you? You seemed busy with work and I didn't like it.
I could tell that my mother loved me dearly in our daily life. However, her love made her go too far, and she made me care for her, so that I won't leave her.
I was worried about you, Emma, you know. And I was lonely.
My mother said such things, but 10 years is a long time. Some of my colleagues got promotions, and they are earning good salaries. Some got married and built happy families. I had wasted my time all this time, giving up on my career and marriage, since I had to care for my mother. The more I thought, the more regretful I became, and I eventually burst into tears. I told her that I had no intention of providing care for her anymore.
I'm leaving the family home today. Don't ever contact me again. Do you understand?
I spoke firmly, hung up, and blocked my mother's number. Several months passed, and I was in a hospital. After the examination, as I was leaving, a man rushed up to me.
Long time no see.
It was Dr. Cannon, my mother's attending physician. But he looked more gaunt and exuded fatigue compared to before. While he knew that my mother's legs had recovered, he accepted money from her and diagnosed her as physically disabled. He received cash from my mother that day too. However, Dr. Fisher mentioned this in a meeting recently, leading to his dismissal. They also learned that he had falsified medical reports. Therefore, Dr. Cannon said that he might get arrested soon. It seems that it's decided that his medical license would be revoked. However, he claimed, "I'm not at fault.
The money I received wasn't a bribe or gratuity. It was hush money from you and used by your mother. That's how I perceived it."
This was so wrong. Dr. Cannon tried to shift the blame to me out of fear of being arrested. I strongly opposed his opinion.
What are you talking about? That's nonsense.
Suddenly, his demeanor changed, and he aggressively approached me.
Can't you listen to me?
I'll tell the police the same thing as I just told you. You know what'll happen if you meddle unnecessarily, right? Dr. Cannon threatened me. I could feel my heart beating faster. It was obvious that he didn't have evidence. However, I didn't have evidence to prove that I had nothing to do with it either. Then, an elderly man stepped in to protect me. At that moment, Dr. Cannon said, with a pale face,
"Director, why are you here?"
I was surprised to realize the person in front of me was the hospital director.
"Dr. Cannon, what exactly are you doing to my daughter?" "Your daughter?"
Dr. Cannon raised his voice. At the same time, I looked at the director as I couldn't believe it. The man before me is the hospital director, my father. That is Johann, about whom my mother had told me. My father, whom my mother divorced when I was young, is the hospital director. However, Dr. Cannon continued to spout nonsense in front of my father.
"She threatened me to write the medical reports." "Director, as a father, don't you want to prevent your daughter from going to jail? Please, lend me your hand, Director."
Dr. Cannon begged for my father's help, but it had no effect on my father.
"Absolutely not. You've turned the hospital and the authorities into enemies. You've deceived my daughter, who provided care for 10 years. You guys schemed this so that her mother can receive disability pensions. You are a scammer, and you will face the consequences."
Dr. Cannon collapsed to his knees. Then, someone tapped my shoulder from behind. When I turned around, my mother was standing there with a terrifying expression on her face. Of course, she wasn't in a wheelchair or using a cane, and she was standing with no problem.
"What are you all doing?"
My mother said, glaring at my father and me.
"Dr. Cannon was looking for you, so I followed him, thinking I would be able to see you that way. But the situation here is getting crazy."
My mother's obsession sent shivers down my spine.
"I won't hand Emma over to you. Emma, let's go."
My mother yelled angrily at my father, seeming quite mad.
"Mom, please stop."
I pushed away my mother's hand and revealed my true feelings.
"I know everything now. Everything you had told me was a lie."
Then, my mother looked down. She had kept lying to me after she got divorced so that I wouldn't meet my father. My father treating my mother like a maid, and him leaving us because of an affair, were all lies. My father, an excellent doctor, had always worked tirelessly without days off. My mother knew this before marrying him, but things changed after I was born. She said that he was an unfit father and decided to file divorce. Then she abruptly left the house, taking me with her. In truth, it wasn't my father and it was my mother, who left home. Following negotiations, despite my father's sufficient income, he lacked time for parenting, so my mother was granted custody. However, my father had been sending a substantial amount of child support. I was astonished when I talked with my father and learned about this. He wanted to meet me and sought many visitations, but my mother kept refusing, claiming I didn't want to see him. The reason why I was able to attend university without financial difficulty, despite the fact that my mother was a single mother, was because my father had paid child support. It was a lie that my mother worked late to pay for my tuition. She actually worked part-time during the day and partied late at night in the city.
Do you have evidence?
She suddenly muttered, looking fierce.
We can probably find a lot if we check your bank book or ask the people at the store you worked for.
Then, my mother looked down and started crying.
I won't live with you anymore. I mean, I can't. I'm sorry, but I'm cutting ties now. Goodbye. Wait a moment. Emma, Emma.
My mother yelled my name. But it didn't matter anymore. After I told her that, I left the hospital with my father. Later, Dr. Cannon was arrested, and his medical license was revoked. For repeatedly falsifying medical records, he received a prison sentence. My mother was ordered to return all the pension she had received and the interest, since she gave money to a doctor, got false medical reports, submitted fraudulent documents, and claimed disability pension. Additionally, she faced charges for aiding fraud. I hope she will admit to her crimes and pay for her sins. Because of this incident, I suffered immense stress, became mentally ill, and ended up seeing a doctor regularly. I now work at the headquarters while undergoing treatment. I went to see Dr. Fisher, who had told me about my mother, to thank her later. After my father and I had a miraculous reunion, we started contacting each other regularly, gradually rebuilding our parent-child relationship. One evening after work, I unexpectedly met my father and we decided to have dinner together. While we were eating in the restaurant, my father started talking.
You can't get back the time you had lost, but there's plenty of time ahead. From now on, live the way you want, Emma.
My father's words deeply resonated. I pledged to cherish the time ahead and enjoy my life.